There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod, and for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Calfa. Let's talk about some wolves. Wasn't able to connect with this individual personally at the Wolf Symposium, but we've been emailing back and forth and finally getting to get on the podcast here with Stephen and I. He's coming to us from Denver, Colorado. He is the director of wolf programs at Churchill Wild, along with being a National Geographic photojournalist. If you haven't visited his website, we'll promote it. Lots of awesome stuff. Jad Davenport. Jad, awesome to see you again. How are you doing, my friend?
Thanks. Oh, it's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
No, this is great. And I, like I said, the symposium was wild in a way that there was just so much happening. I just want to get your take, because Stephen asked this question when we had Nick Jivak on last time. What were your thoughts about the symposium? How do you think it went? How did your presentation go? We'll obviously get more into the details, but what were your takeaways from Minnesota?
My thoughts about the symposium, it was fantastic. You know, John, I'm not a scientist or a biologist. I'm a naturalist. So for me to have access to 400 other individuals, you know, biologists, wildlife biologists from all over the world, wolf enthusiasts, wolf students, a lot of PhD students doing incredible research. So I felt very lucky to be there because I'm new to the kind of whole wolf world. So it was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed the opportunity to get to know people, hear what kinds of research is going on. I gave a talk on Churchill Wild Citizen Science Program, where we're studying our wolves up on the Hudson Bay and the relationship with polar bears. And it was a lot of fun to give that talk because I think it's something that's fairly new to wolf biologists and people that are researching wolves. There's no information out there at all about wolves predating on polar bears predating on wolves, the whole intraspecies activity that's going on. It just doesn't, and part of that, John, is it doesn't happen anywhere else in the world that we know of. The polar bears, you know, the largest marine carnivore, I should say the largest terrestrial carnivore on the planet, roaming around, it rarely crosses paths with wolves, and their ranges don't overlap too much. So we're in a very interesting area, and we have great opportunities to kind of see how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, your talk was jammed, and I know there were a lot of biologists that I talked to at Yellowstone who I saw them make a beeline for this talk, and I'm really happy that you got that exposure. And I think this is obviously, when I saw it on there, I think Steve and I, before we even came to Minnesota, I said, this can't be a real thing because it was never talked about before. So the fact that you're there, you're doing the research, I know you say you're a naturalist, but you're breaking new ground, and that's so fantastic. How did you get into that field? Because I know you're a bear guide, a bear photojournalist, right? At heart. So how did this opportunity come up for you? Where did this all come about, and how do you get started?
Well, I got started as a National Geographic photographer, and the running joke with a lot of National Geographic photographers is that our new job is talking about our old job. So I would go up to these luxury eco lodges, and I would teach visual storytelling to people, kind of what we do at National Geographic. And as it happened, Churchill Wild kept inviting me up. They've got 5 fantastic luxury lodges up in the Arctic. So over the last 10 years, I became very familiar with polar bears. I was doing a lot of work, got my license to lead tours on the ground with polar bears out there, and really got to know polar bears very well. At one of the lodges, only one of the lodges that they have, we started seeing a lot of wolves. And it was always kind of an afterthought. People were there to see and photograph polar bears. So we'd be heading out on, you know, the ATVs or heading out on foot to go see some polar bears. And someone would say, oh, there's a wolf. And we'd all get excited and take a few pictures. But it wasn't until I would say about 3 years ago, I had been building an igloo, teaching some of the guests how to build an igloo. We built a fantastic igloo in front of the lodge, and I thought, oh, I'm going to go out and sleep in it tonight. You know, I'm going to drag my sleeping bag out there. And as I went out to check the igloo out, I noticed that a pack of wolves was around it. And I thought, now what are they doing? So I go out to the igloo, and the complete backside of the igloo, they had peed all over it. They had just... And I thought, now, wait a second, what's going on? You know, clearly they're marking territory. And so I went back to the lodge manager and I said, hey, what's going on? And he's like, oh, they just want to let you know that this is their area and you're not welcome here. And I said, well, how am I going to sleep in my igloo? And he's like, well, you better go out and see if you can mark it a little bit higher. And so over the next day, I had this kind of war going on with the wolves, this pissing contest. And finally I said, you guys win. And I thought, here's this incredibly intelligent animal, this social animal, just like us, this animal that I can understand because I, like most people in North America, I've owned dogs. I have a pet dog sitting with me right here. We grew up with dogs. So I always tell people that come up to do our citizen science, you're already an expert in wolf behavior. You just don't know it. Because we're looking at Canis lupus, right? The wild wolf, but your dog has many of the same behaviors. So I think that for me, the transition from polar bears into wolves, I was just fascinated with these creatures. And I said, okay, I need to study. And, John, I started researching the wolves in this area, and there was nothing on it. There were no studies that had been done in this particular area, no research. It's just so remote, and there's nothing there. There's no natural resources that anybody wants right now. So no one's ever conducted studies on these wolves. And I thought, well, what's to stop us from investigating? Who are these wolves? How many are there? What are they doing?
I want to go back just one more step from this part of your story. How do you even find yourself becoming a National Geographic photographer? It seems like one of the summits of being a wildlife photographer. Am I wrong about that, or how do you end up there?
No, Stephen, you're right. It's becoming a National Geographic photographer. I always say people take many different paths. I like to say I was an overnight success after 20 years. It took me a long time. When I first started out as a photographer, I spent 10 years doing war photography, and it was just as a freelancer. It was on my own. It was saving up money, working as a house painter, working as a substitute teacher, digging ditches in construction areas, just get enough money to send myself off on an assignment. And I got lucky. National Geographic called me up one day out of the blue, and they had seen a photo I had taken of some sea kayakers in Baja, Mexico. And so my editor there, Sabine, said, Jad, we want this photo for a cover. And, as you can imagine, I was so excited, right? I mean, I'm making $8 an hour at a construction site, and here National Geographic calls me out of the blue. Well, the funny thing was, right before I got this call, or right before I went on that assignment to shoot, I had ditched all my film cameras and switched to digital. So I was very excited. I said, I will send you the digital file. And there was this pause on the phone, and Sabine said, oh, we don't take digital photos. Sorry, goodbye. And I was crushed. And a week later, she called back and she said, okay, Jed, look, send me the raw file. And I had no clue what I was doing. I had photographed it in a JPEG. And again, she's like, we can't use it. Goodbye. And finally, she called me up 3 weeks later and she said, okay, Jed, we're desperate. Just send us whatever you have.
Love it.
And so I sent her the photo. It became National Geographic's first digital cover shot. And that kind of opened the door for me. And so, it was a lot of luck. I was very fortunate. I happened to have a photo, and I always tell young photographers, editors buy photos they need, not photos they like. So they needed a photo of sea kayakers in Magdalena Bay, and I had one, and I got lucky. So that was kind of my fortunate. But after easily a decade and a half of just supporting myself on my own assignments.
Man, that's so awesome. What was it like for you? I'll stay on this for a minute too before we get into the other stuff. What was that transition like for you as you get the cover and now you're a National Geographic photographer? What's that work like? What's the legwork? What's the trips? What's that all entail for you for the next however many years before you start doing the polar bear wolf thing?
Right. So the funny thing is, after National Geographic asked me to join up with their National Geographic creative group as one of their photographers, they said, we'd like to represent your work. So my life didn't change that much. I was still out there hustling assignments, doing a lot of work with Islands Magazine, Men's Journal, Outside. And I would go on these assignments, and then I would send outtakes to my editor at National Geographic. They would take in the shoots. I did a couple of assignments for National Geographic Adventure. And so I would go off on the assignments. But really, I don't know any National Geographic photographers that make a full-time living out of it. It's just, it doesn't pay very well, despite what everyone seems to think. So I think it's just kind of it's nice to have that little yellow box But I think for any photographer, you kind of get over it and you're back out doing your own work. You're doing what you're passionate about. You're not waiting for National Geographic to call you up out of the blue and say, Chad, can you go do a story on Pitcairn Island? You're doing the same thing you always do as a freelancer, which is you find a way to get there. You find another magazine that will pay for some travel. You go off and you create your own assignments.
Is that because there are just so many photographers shooting for Nat Geo? Is that why it's hard for individuals to make a living, or is it just because projects take so long? So really the delivery of the images that you get paid for, I mean, you're going on these incredible journeys just to capture a few photos, I assume. Or why is it so hard to shoot for this, massive, like I said, one of the summits of photography and really make a living?
I think it has to do with both things you said. There's a lot of photographers out there shooting for National Geographic. There's the value of images has gone down recently. And so there used to be, we would go back to National Geographic headquarters every January and have a meeting where all the photographers would get together and they'd kind of give their State of the Union address.
I see.
And we had an informal contest with some of the photographers to see whose photo had sold for the least amount of money. And so I think it was down. One of my buddies, it was like 1/10 of a cent after Nat Geo had their cut, and then maybe Alamy had their cut, and maybe it was a professor downloading an image for a talk. So it was maybe, but I think there's this incorrect belief out there about the $1 million image. You go out,
right,
you take an amazing shot of a wolf right in front of a polar bear, and people say, wow, that's the $1 million shot. Well, you might get lucky to make a couple $100 off that shot per magazine. So it's really a volume question. I'm sure there are Nat Geo photographers who have figured out a way to make a living at it. But most of the folks that I know, the women and men, we all have other part-time jobs. Some are doctors, some are architects,
sure,
some are wildlife biologists. So yeah, I would discourage anyone from going for it. But I would also tell photographers, don't worry if you never shoot for National Geographic. There are some incredible photographers, far better than I am, whose work I admire, and they've never shot for National Geographic. It's life, it's luck. You might get a break, you might not, but never let that stop anyone from shooting.
Yeah. I was just curious because we do have I think we have a lot of photographers that listen to this podcast that'd be interested in that, but it's not a bad second job.
Exactly.
Oh man. Just one more thing on the symposium, Jad, was there anybody specific for you? I know you were, you said you're new to the field, quote unquote. Was there anyone there that you had a conversation with or wanted to meet that you were almost awestruck about, that you said, hey, I got to talk to this person? Or were you just trying to talk to as many people as possible? What was your game plan when you got there and you saw all these people there?
Right. My game plan when I got to the symposium was that I don't have much to offer. I'm here to learn from everybody. And of course there are, being new to the wolf world, there are of course the luminaries, the Doug Smith and, Meach, and there's everyone that people are gathering around. And I didn't meet any of those, but I met some fantastic people. I met some fantastic PhD students, some fantastic wolf researchers. So my goal was just to get out and meet as many people as possible.
Does it change anything for you going forward, or does it reinvigorate anything, or does it inspire you to something new, or even a way of just seeing wolves and the research that you might do going forward? Does being integrated in that type of space now for the first time for you, does it change anything?
Oh, absolutely. After the symposium, I wanted to pack up my bags and just move to the Arctic and spend the rest of my life studying wolves.
That's great.
Because, the people, they're so engaging, these biologists and researchers, and even wolf enthusiasts, people that run wolf sanctuaries. So I was I've always been excited about this citizen science program that we're doing. And it just gave me so many ideas. I had so many people come up to me and say, have you thought about sequencing DNA like this? Have you thought about doing Howell surveys? Have you thought about tracking, different ways to track? And people were so generous with their time. I think, one of the things, Stephen, that was interesting to me, and I think when Doug Smith was talking and giving some of his talks about the wolves in Yellowstone, that I realized the wolves that I work with are a completely wild population. There's no pressure on them. They don't see any other people. They're in this vast wilderness. But I'm realizing now, being in Colorado, that Doug was saying, look, if you want to live with wolves, there has to be some kind of wolf control, because we're both apex predators. We both want the same thing. We want resources, wolves need wolves need resources. So I think, and that's been a hard thing for me to kind of understand, because I don't agree with trophy hunting at all, or trapping when you're just going out for the fun of it. But I also see the other side of it. I see the ranchers, the people concerned about their kids. So I think I'm becoming a little bit out of the whole daydream of wow, isn't this great? You know, running with the wolves in the Arctic, to realizing, okay, there's a lot going on here. So yeah, I would say it opened my eyes, and hopefully it's giving me a broader sense of what it means to be a person in this world where there are wolves.
That's a great perspective, I think, to take away. And I think a lot of people are, I think, did take that away from that. I mean, switching gears now to the work there at Churchill Wild. I mean, just describe everybody what you're talking about when you mean by citizen science and how this all began. So obviously you talked about the igloo and the peace story. So now when you guys really decide, okay, we're going to study this pack of wolves, or these packs of wolves here that are around this lodge, how does that get started, and what are the tasks that you guys are trying to figure out how to do on a daily basis and a yearly basis to collect all this data?
Mm-hmm. When Churchill Wild, when I first proposed this idea to them and said, hey, we have this opportunity, I think, to go out and study these wolves and include our guests as part of the program. I had done some research about citizen science. As I mentioned, I am not a wildlife biologist. I don't have that background. I do have a background as a naturalist. I worked for many years for the Forest Service and have spent most of my lifetime photographing wildlife. And what I started realizing is that there's this need for citizen science in areas. There's so many protected areas around the world and so many remote areas where biologists can't go, researchers can't go for funding reasons, or because there's nothing of interest there to other outside parties that's going to support a study. So I looked at what we could do as citizen scientists and proposed this idea to Churchill Wild. We proposed it to some of our guests and said, would you be interested in coming up, helping us do a baseline study of these wolves? And that involves, we go out, we set up trail cameras. We want to know how many wolves are in the area. We want to know how many individual wolves are in a pack, what packs are in the area. We go out, track the wolves. What are they feeding on? Take a look at their scat, take a look at their kills. We got equipment to start doing howl surveys to see if we could begin to attach certain signature howls of a wolf to this individual wolf. And so when people are up there now, they have the option that we have all this equipment. We give daily kind of seminars on wolf biology, wolf culture. How are packs formed? How do they disperse? What's the life cycle of a wolf? What's the history of humans and wolves? We go over things such as wolves in literature, wolf attacks on humans. You know, we try and cover everything during the day. So people are learning a lot about wolves as we go along. And then we're out in the field every day trying to track the packs, trying to collect data, you know, checking the trail cameras. And what's exciting is that the guests are doing it themselves. I'm not setting up these trail cameras. I'm learning with the guests. We go out, wolves destroy one of our trail cameras. We sit around as a group and think, all right, what are we going to do next time? How are we going to do this better? So it's become fantastic. We had one of the first guests on the program was a rancher from Montana. And he has wolves on his property. He was fantastic. He's got a multi-generational ranch up in Montana. So I asked him one night, I said, would you be willing to do a Q&A with the group and talk to us about what it's like to ranch with wolves? He gave a fantastic talk about both the pros and cons that he sees. We had a woman who specializes in sled dogs, racing sled dogs. And we asked if she would give a little talk on dog behavior. And she gave a fantastic talk on what she sees and kind of the group. So I truly believe that everybody that comes on these trips, apart from and participates in the wolf study, apart from just learning the information that we have to share with them, they also have something to add to whether we had one guy that was a musician, and I had no idea how to look at doing wolf surveys, well, you know, recording the wolf howls. And he had some fantastic ideas. He set up the microphones, went out, got some fantastic howling on there.
Wow. I mean, it's great because you're using everybody's talents and you're educating and informing at the same time, which is so valuable and really just a strong way to keep everybody involved. And as you say, to get all different perspectives. I think that's such a valuable thing that Stephen and I preach all the time here on the podcast, is that if everyone's involved and everyone has all the information at their fingertips, you can make the most educated decision about how you want to move forward with whether it's wolf study or any kind of study there. Just gives people a little bit of an idea, because you said this beautifully at your talk in the 15 minutes that they gave you, which I still think was a little bit too short. I said this to Nick too. I was like, wow, they really squeezed you guys. But really just give everybody the environment that we're talking about, because we're talking into Manitoba, Canada, which I believe is the subarctic you were saying, and how that shifts and how cold that can get. So just give everybody a little bit of the environment you're talking about that you're studying in.
Right, John. So the environment where we're conducting the citizen science program with Churchill Wild, it sits in northern Manitoba, right on the Hudson Bay. The First Nation name for it, from the Swampy Cree, is Kaskatama. It's the Kaska Coast. And technically, it's subarctic. So you're at Nanook Polar Bear Lodge, where we are. You look around, you're surrounded by black spruce, and you're surrounded by willow, and it looks just like you're in the boreal forest. Now, if you take a walk 100 meters outside the front of the lodge, you get out onto the Arctic tundra. There's a coastal plain of tundra right along the coast. And so we're at this magical confluence between the subarctic and the Arctic. And it really, during the summer, the days are glorious with the exception of the insects. But, for most of the time, it's warm. It's 60s, 70s up there. I've even been up there when it's been 80s and even 90s, which is troubling now, of course. But in the winter, you go from the subarctic, this forest where you're, maybe snowshoeing around the forest looking at wolf tracks. And then you walk that same 100 meters out and you are on the tundra. You're looking at the sea ice. And if you look straight north, you feel like you're at the North Pole. There's nothing but sea ice. The next road you're going to hit is, 10,000 miles over the North Pole somewhere in Russia. So it's a very extreme environment. It's when we do the wolf studies, it's in March, which is still the winter. It's spring, but winter. And I tested the temperature once when I was driving a snowmobile. With wind chill, it was minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So you have this land of extremes, but I tell you, it is so much fun because you're kitted out in heavy parkas, right? We provide all the gear, and you're up there with First Nation guides. You're learning how to build fires with no matches. You're learning how to build igloos. So there's a lot of survival training we do just as part of the course, because you're going to be out in this extreme environment for 10 days. But it's just a magical area. And one of the things I mentioned during the talk is that it's as though we've given you the golden key to Yellowstone National Park before it was Yellowstone National Park, except this park is the size of California with nobody else in there except for you.
Man, that's incredible. What's it like with partnering with the First Nations there? What kind of element does that bring for people that are there and for yourself as well?
So partnering with the First Nation, with the York Landing First Nation, it's fantastic. We depend heavily on a couple of the members of the First Nation who come up and guide for us. In particular, Albert Sanders, Butch Saunders, is a longtime guide, and he grew up hunting, trapping, fishing that whole coastline. And so when you go out with Butch in the field, it's a whole different experience than being out with someone like myself or another one of the guides. We have a limited understanding. I can tell you about the wildlife from maybe the Western science viewpoint, but Butch will get you out there and he'll put you inside the landscape and he'll look at maybe moose tracks and he can help you understand what this moose is doing or why this wolf is headed this way. So I think it's very important. This is their land. They were moved back in the 1950s from very close to where the lodge is now down south. And so they still try and get up onto the land when they can to hunt and fish. But that connection has been broken. There's not. So it is something very special that we're hoping to bring back. We're hoping to get the First Nations more involved. They have so much information. They're really the only people that know about the wolves up there. So this traditional knowledge, when I sit and chat with Butch and say, Butch, why do the wolves hunt the bears? And, maybe science would say there's a different rationale based on, calories, output and input. And Butch will say it's because they don't like each other. They both are number one. And they meet each other and they're like, I'm number one. No, I'm number one. And they fight. And then sometimes, I'll say, well, why is the wolf it looks like it's playing with the bear. And he'll say, well, the wolf is bored. The bear is bored. So I think you're right. drawing on that close connection the First Nations have with their land has definitely made it a much more authentic experience. And we're really hoping to expand that, to bring them more into what we're working on, and then be a part of, share what we're learning with their community as well.
When you're on these expeditions, how close do you and your group get to polar bears and wolves, like in terms of physical distance?
Sure, that's a great question, Stephen. And so at the symposium, I remember a biologist stood up and was talking about, he was retiring, and he was mentioning how one of the highlights of his life was seeing a wolf 30 feet away, and the crowd kind of gasped. And I leaned forward and was looking at Adam, the CEO of Churchill Wild, and Adam Paulson. I said, Adam, this is crazy. We have this extraordinary wolf encounter. We have these extraordinary wolf encounters. So before we started the wolf study, I was off my snow machine once photographing a polar bear, and a wolf walked up and sniffed my boot. Just sniffed. I was busy looking at I had turned it and I'm like, oh, there's a wolf. He trotted over, sniffed my boot, looked at me, and I didn't know what to do. I wasn't scared. I thought he wasn't acting aggressive. And then he backed up maybe, 2 or 3 meters and curled up, stomped down, and went to sleep. And so now, of course, this is not the kind of encounter that we want for guests. And this is before we started our study. But I think when you look at the viewing opportunities, very often we have very close range. A couple of meters, a wolf. On our very first expedition, we were taking the guests out as a shakedown hike. Make sure, your gear fits. Make sure you're comfortable hiking on the tundra. And it was just a little, half-hour hike out of the lodge. And all of a sudden, one of the guests said, oh, there's a wolf. And we turned around, and a wolf was just trotting along behind us, sniffing at everyone's boots, footprints in the snow. So I had everyone stop and said, we'll take some pictures. Just stay in your groups. Don't move. And this wolf did a little figure 8 around the group, sniffing in the air, looking at people, maybe from 6-7 feet away. And then its curiosity was apparently satisfied, and it trotted off. Now, these are unusual occurrences. So mostly we like to see them from a distance where we're not interfering with them.
And just go a few layers deeper, if you can, into how you have seen or what the reports are of how polar bears and wolves are interacting, from the most usual to maybe the most rare and extreme scenarios that you've witnessed or that you've heard about.
Right. With wolf-polar bear interactions. So personally, what I've seen, the times that I've been up there, observing wolves and polar bears, often they're both aware of each other, right? The bears will smell the polar. I'm sorry, let me start again. So the polar bears and wolves are almost always aware of each other. The wolves will be sniffing the air. They'll know there's a polar bear in the area. The bear will be sniffing the air. It'll know a wolf pack's in the area. Often, the most common occurrence is the wolves will kind of trot on by, look at the bear, and keep moving. Same with the bear. He might be going on, especially if he's a big male, he might look at the wolves and just keep doing whatever he's doing. Now, this changes in March when the mother polar bears are emerging from their dens back in the forest, and they've got 3-month-old cubs. And they're trying to get from the forest, maybe 100 kilometers back in this forest, out to the sea ice. At this time of year, we believe the wolves are hunting polar bears. So this mother polar bear with her 2 or 3 cubs will have to run this gauntlet of wolf packs. And so we'll observe this mostly in the tracks, right? So we're mostly observing this, that we'll follow a polar bear's tracks, and we'll see the wolves kind of converge on it and then head out. I have seen wolves chasing polar bears and their cubs. I've seen this in the summer where the pack of wolves will chase a mother polar bear with one of her, what we call cub of the year. Now, at this point in the summer, the cubs, he weighs several hundred pounds. Usually the wolves will chase the bears. If this happens, the bears will retreat to the water and swim away. We have had a guide that witnessed the wolf pack attacking a mother polar bear and 2 large cubs. And at one point, this mother polar bear had 2 wolves clamped on her, one on her throat, one on her back. And the guide said she was spinning around and the wolves were flying off of her. And she was fighting for her life, fighting for the life of her cubs. The wolf pack pounced on top of one of these polar bears. And again, these are fairly substantial cubs at this time of the year. It managed to get away. She managed to fight off the wolves and retreat to the water. But we have, biologists have found when they were working up in Wapusk National Park, which is very close to us, immediately to our north, they did find remains of a polar bear that had been scavenged. And certainly the traditional knowledge from Butch and others says that, yes, wolves will hunt the polar bears, particularly this time of year. We will see the wolf pack sitting out on the sea ice, and they'll be making a circuit up and down the coast. And the minute they pick up the scent of a polar bear, they're kind of on those tracks and trying to hunt them.
When these folks are seeing wolves killing a polar bear, they 100% of the time are also witnessing them eating the bear, meaning there's an obvious difference between this and say killing a coyote because it's competition. This is hunting.
The few times that people have witnessed polar bear cubs being killed by wolves, the wolves did consume the polar bear cubs.
Right.
Now, that's not to say, Stephen, that they don't also just kill because they feel there's competition, or, watching the wolf pack too. It's very fascinating. I was watching the wolves in a standoff with a wolverine last year, and wolverines are pretty tough little guys, right? But these wolves, they had a moose kill, so they weren't interested in eating the wolverine. At least I don't believe they were interested in eating the wolverine, but they chased the wolverine, treat him up there, and it may have been to say, hey, stay off our carcass, this is ours. Or maybe they were teaching the young pups how to hunt. I've watched the wolf pack go after foxes. The entire, we've had 16 wolves chasing down a red fox. Now, for the amount of calories expended, I can't imagine that that's going to pay off, but maybe that's the adults, the breeding pair, teaching the young pups how to hunt. I don't know. The fox got away.
Man, it seems like you have so much. The names that you're saying here: wolverine, moose, polar bear. Well, these are mega fauna. At least those three: moose, polar bear, and wolf, all in the same area. Is insane to have those animals in the same space as they are. What's it like? In other words, how many packs have you guys recorded? Have you gotten that data secured? How many resident polar bears do you have? Do you have an idea of numbers wise, and do they fluctuate as much? I know the study's early on, but I don't know what you guys have found out thus far.
Sure. So for your question about numbers, how many packs are there in the area? One of the things that I've learned both through the symposium and earlier research is that the packs are fluctuating constantly, as you guys know, and they're dividing and splitting, and new packs are being formed. So initially, when I started collecting traditional knowledge, our lodge sat on the boundary of two packs. There was a pack in the east and a pack in the west, and they would fight basically right at the lodge. That seems to have shifted in the last 2 years. Our most recent field study, which was in March of this year, we had one pack with 16 individuals that we call the Opayastan pack. That's the Cree word for the big wind, named for the Opayastan Creek that runs out right there. So at this point, we believe that we're in the middle of the Opayastan pack's territory. Now, we did travel far to the east on snow machines. We did find an area along another creek where the wolves had been doing a lot of marking, defecating, urinating. So our suspicion was perhaps that was one of the boundaries. One of the things we want to find out, particularly in the winter, as you mentioned, this is a strange area. You've got boreal subarctic animals like moose right next to Arctic animals like polar bears. So we want to find out in the winter when the bay freezes, do the wolves range far out on the sea ice? Do they suddenly expand their range? Not that there's much to hunt out there, but maybe they'll be taking a polar bear. We don't know. Biologists are studying the polar bears in the area. What happens is a seasonal migration. So every year the Hudson Bay thaws, the polar bears move on to the land to kind of do what we call a walking hibernation. They're basically just biding their time for the ice to freeze again, because their staple prey is seal. So they need to get out there on that platform. And that's we're the southernmost population of polar bears on the planet. And that's probably why we're seeing this dynamic between the wolves and the polar bears in this area. And your question, how many polar bears? Typically, I tell people don't expect to see polar bears when we're up there, because generally when we're doing the study in November and March, the polar bears are out on the ice. That said, last year we were running into 4 or 5 polar bears every day. We were having to,
wow, no way.
Anytime we went on a hike, we were having to push bears away or avoid them to kind of, work on our wolf study. And in March, we have in the last few years been seeing at least one mom and a cub or 2 cubs coming out of the dens. We intercept them from where they are to kind of follow and see what's going on with them. It's tricky. You don't want to announce to the wolves, here's a mother polar bear and cubs. So we do a lot of long distance viewing through spotting scopes. Binoculars are the key tool that we use. So we're not going to be hopping onto a mother polar bear's track, following her, because then of course the wolves would be able to just follow right in our tracks. And we don't feel that would be a way to do a non-invasive study.
Are there stories of the reverse, meaning polar bears killing wolves?
I have not heard or collected any stories of polar bears killing wolves. I'm sure it could happen. There's no reason. We did find an area where a polar bear had been digging into a bank, a sandy bank. Found that a couple years ago, and it's possible that the polar bear was digging out. It looked like an old wolf den. It's very possible the polar bear was digging. There is no reason that a polar bear wouldn't, if it found cubs and the adults weren't around. I'm sure a polar bear could very easily predate on and consume cubs.
What do they eat when they're on the land during this walking hibernation?
So it's very interesting when you're asking about what do polar bears eat while they're on this walking hibernation out there. Typically, our answer is nothing. They graze on berries. Now, they're not getting much nutritional value that we can see. The berries pass right through their system. So we imagine they're just kind of filling their stomachs. They're just kind of, and it probably tastes good, right? The blueberries. Every now and then they will get some waterfowl when the birds are fledging. Now, the very interesting thing that's been happening lately is that just north of us, polar bears that traditionally, as far as we know, were not hunting anything during the summers, are now hunting beluga whales. They have, and I've seen this. It's incredible. These bears that typically in the middle of summer should be skinny are going out onto these submerged rocks at river estuaries where the beluga, these large whales, 20 feet long, are coming in, rubbing off skin, chasing smelt, and they're launching themselves off these rocks, landing on a beluga, smashing the melon or the blowhole. I don't quite know how they're doing it. They're killing belugas, letting them wash ashore, and now we're seeing bears that are massive at a time of year that traditionally science says they should be skinny. They're skinniest.
There has to be casualties when hunting an animal like this. It's just mind-blowing that an animal this strong, this large, this intelligent is succumbing to wolves without some amount of retaliation and casualty. But it's just amazing that they're taking down animals like this. And that leads me to my next question. In terms of human interaction with polar bears, what is their temperament like? And you could even, I guess you could compare it to grizzly bear temperament so that we have like a common ground, a place to start from. But what's it like running into a polar bear versus maybe a grizzly?
It's very, very exciting running into a polar bear versus a grizzly. I did a lot of my early training on grizzly bears, coastal brown bears, interior grizzlies. And grizzlies are largely herbivores, right? I mean, the coastal brown bears, they'll be eating fish. Polar bears are 100% carnivorous. And whereas almost every time you encounter a grizzly bear, it's going to run. It's hard to get close to grizzlies unless you're in areas where there's a lot of tourism, where they become habituated to people like up in Alaska, where they're walking right by you. With a polar bear, almost always it's going to come and investigate you. So if you see a polar bear, in my experience, and it sees you, it's walking around or it's sleeping, chances are it's going to come and investigate, because that's how they stay alive. They investigate everything. They want to say, are you food? Are you a threat? Can I mate with you? Or are you just background entertainment? And some of the best experiences we've had with polar bears, they will come and investigate us. And the minute we're trained as polar bear guides, we're trained how to manage their behavior and understand their behavior. And we carry all kinds of deterrents. Almost always, the only deterrent we have to use is our voice. The bear comes in, he wants a look-see, and we're talking to him. We're letting him know that we're a group of people. Polar bear, when it sees a group of people, like any bear, grizzly bear is going to typically wants to get away. The funniest encounters with polar bears we've had are with the young males that are typically like a year or two out from mom. They're getting thumped by the big guys if they get too close. So they're kind of hanging out, pair bonding with other young adults, males. And they'll hang out together, usually the same size. They'll do a lot of sparring, kind of boxing, and play with one another. And on several occasions, I've seen one of them gets accidentally hurt by the bigger bear. and runs off. So the bigger bear, it just looks crushed. Here, this little bear that he was playing with, that was his buddy. They were sleeping side by side for a month. Now he's got nothing. I've often seen them, they'll come up. And we had one just recently that came up. This was, I believe, a young female, and she grabbed a piece of kelp or seaweed. She came right up to us and started thrashing it around just to kind of say, hey, look at this. They do a lot of play behavior, play eliciting behavior, like little bows, like the dogs, and wag their head. And we have to say, look, we're not here to play. I'm sorry, you need to back up. We're going to back up and let you go. But you can look in their eyes and watch their behavior and think, oh, man, they would just be so excited if I could throw this piece of kelp and they could play fetch. And I'm putting it out there as a guide with the kind of behavior that we see. But it's rarely is it aggressive, and we're trained to manage any kind of aggressive behavior. And it's with any large predator, we just give them space. That's the key, is just give them space.
Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating though, because everything that you're describing is the closest encounters I think I've ever heard, both with wolves, polar bears, and the fact that you're able to navigate these situations, it seems with relative ease. It doesn't seem as though, and I guess it speaks to, like you say, the giving space. As long as you give the animal space, we don't invade, like you say, if they're going down a trail, don't follow them, things like that. They seem to not really care as much. Do you find that your presence, not just you specifically, but the guests and the investigation and the science and everything you guys are doing, has it, shifted their behavior at all, or is it really seem they sort of adapted to you all being there in their daily lives?
I think our presence certainly impacts the polar bears and the wolves, but in a very minor way. I think the only impact it has really is that we're something that's interesting for them to look at. Much of the time the polar bears are out there sleeping. They're just waiting. They see some guests hiking out in the tundra. Okay, maybe they'll go and investigate, check it out. The same with the wolves. If they're off on a hunt and they're on to a moose or something, they just go right by us. They don't stop. But occasionally, it seems like once or twice a week, they will, as they patrol their territory or on the hunt, they will stop off at the lodge, curl up in the snow, and go to sleep. And I think it stems from this close relationship wolves have always had with people. Our lodge was at one point, decades ago, a hunting lodge, a goose hunting lodge. I have no doubt that over the decades that it was there, wolves would go by, pick up carcasses of geese that had been missed. There's also a First Nations hunting camp further away that the wolves make a loop around that too. And I'm sure they will pick up pieces of, gut piles, bones, not enough to support themselves, certainly, but it's something that I believe they continue to check out. So if a First Nation hunter takes a moose nearby, which they're allowed to do, it's part of open, they're going to leave behind the legs, the gut pile. And the wolves, I think, will certainly cruise by, sniff, take some bites, and head on. And so I do think that we have to recognize, even when I say that these wolves are under no hunting pressure, they certainly could be. If anyone decided, I would like to go hunt it, that's a question, what happens then? But I think by and large, they exist in this relationship with people where they will come by, check us out. They are, in the sense, they're habituated to us. They know we're not a threat to them. We're not feeding them, so they don't have that kind of habituation. But they do know who we are. I think that's pretty clear. Some wolves will venture in, check us out, and some wolves are a little more cautious and will stay further away from us.
What's the First Nation stance, when you talk to Butch about their relationship with the wolf and even the polar bear for that matter? I'm sure they've had interactions with both throughout the course of their history. What's the information that he gives to you and that you relay then to the guests about how their coexistence was and is to this day?
Sure. And how do the First Nations, the York Landing First Nations, relate to the wolves and the polar bears? And that's a great question. And it's one I've posed to Butch several times. It seems to be a very equal relationship. Butch is a hunter. He grew up hunting on the land. The wolves are hunters. So I think there's a lot of respect there. Certainly at times in the past, they did harvest wolves. I think their relationship with polar bears is one of great respect. These people are out on the land. When they were doing a lot of hunting out on the land, they had to be very careful. They're polar bears. Polar bears are the largest land carnivore on the planet, and they will come and investigate. It's a very different beast than a grizzly bear. And so I think there's a lot of respect. Obviously I can't speak on behalf of the First Nations, but I think that's what I've picked up through talking to some of the members of the tribe, that there's a lot of respect. They seem to enjoy seeing the wolves. Some of the people in York Landing First Nations will send me photographs of the wolves when they're around the hunting camp. And they seem genuinely excited. They're like, hey, we saw these wolves down there. We know you're working on a study. Are these the same wolves? That sort of thing.
Wow. What's the typical, I always like this, especially because wolves in the continental U.S. seem to be a little bit smaller. Are the wolves up there bigger? I would imagine they have to be in that 120-pound range, or do you guys have you been able to, tranquilize and, pardon me, and study any sort of their size and shape, or have you guys not gotten to that part yet?
Sure, we have not gotten to that part of a study yet. Our intention right now is to keep it a very non-invasive study based on First Nation traditional knowledge. When I ask them what's the largest wolf, it might be 120 to 160 pounds. It's possible some of them are larger.
Wow.
These are large wolves. They're predating on large mammals, the moose, polar bears, things like that. So we don't know exactly what subspecies they are. We suspect they're Canis lupus nubilis. And that's one of the things that we're going to be working on. I was chatting with a couple of researchers. Kira Cassidy out of Yellowstone has been a fantastic help. Ellen Dimitri out of Oregon. They've given us ideas on how we can move forward to determine what subspecies of wolf are these. Are they related to one another? Is there much, are they an inbred population? Are they getting DNA from outside, they're getting, influx of other genes from other wolf populations. So that's kind of on tap for these upcoming seasons, is to look more into that.
Wow. Are you looking to possibly get help from these biologists to come there and assist, or do you think you're going to be relying on the tools that you have so far? Because I know what I found at the symposium, and you probably did too, and you said this earlier, is that there's a lot of communal sharing of knowledge, sharing of techniques, things like that. Have you received any interest from any biologists saying, I could swing by for a week or a month and possibly help out? Have you gotten any offers like that in the future?
I think to say, have we gotten any offers would be an understatement. It was gratifying to us. We had so many biologists come up and say, I want to come up. I want to see these wolves. So many biologists said, if I see a wolf, it's running across a road, hundreds of meters away, or maybe I'm watching them through a scope in Yellowstone at 2 kilometers. And so I think the biologists are very interested. The part of the challenge we are dealing with at Churchill Wild is that it's so remote. It's so expensive to get guests up there. It's so expensive. Every person that comes requires a certain amount of fuel, a certain amount of food. Now, personally, and I know that Churchill Wild as well, we would love to bring up and rotate some wolf biologists, wolf behaviorists that could contribute to our study as far as with guests and kind of help them understand it. We want to keep the study as our own study. We want to conduct the study ourselves, but we would like to get input. And certainly one of the things I would love to see is a way that we could down the road maybe help young researchers, give them some opportunities to see wolves. We're in a place like the Casca Coast where you can see them up close and observe them. But right now, at this point, it's such a new program that we're just struggling to keep up with demand. We have so many guests that want to come up. Our trips tend to be sold out of people that want to come up and participate. But I'm sure that down the road, we would love to work on some partnerships with biologists and PhD students and things like that.
Do you see anything in the future, and you did touch on this a little bit in your discussion, that, and you even said it before, with the temperatures slightly getting a little bit higher than you've seen, how do you feel that climate shift is going to impact these big predators? Because clearly they already have somewhat of a balance, it seems, at this point, to either deal with each other or not. Do you think that's going to escalate in the coming years? Do you feel that where Churchill Wild sits and where you guys sit is remote enough to where it may not impact it? Or do you see things that are coming down the road quicker than possibly you would have ever imagined?
So how will climate change what are we anticipating, or what have we seen, how it will impact this area? That's another fantastic question. I have only been working up in this corner of the Arctic for the last 10 years. I've been working throughout the Arctic in Siberia and Greenland for the past 30 years. So and even then, that's a small scale of time. Clearly, climate change is happening. And how is it going to affect the wolves and the polar bears down there? I don't think that we know right away. I think we're seeing some interesting things like the polar bears actually doing really well right now in that population in the Hudson Bay. We're seeing very healthy bears during the summer. So now, is this an anomaly?
Yeah.
I know that other bears further north might be suffering more because maybe they're out, they den on the ice and the ice is changing. We really don't know. One thing I do know is that bears are pretty intelligent and adaptable animals. We're starting to see grizzly bears, barren land grizzly bears come into the area, and that seems to be new. They've seen that north in Wapusk. We've seen there are sightings down around where we are at Nunavut Polar Bear Lodge. So I'm wondering how that's going to impact the environment. But the big answer is we don't know, but we're very interested to look at that.
Are grizzlies and polar bears mating often?
They have had cases of polar bears and grizzly bears mating and producing offspring, either Pizzly bears or Growler bears. There's a few accounts of that. And it's not something I think that scientists have seen a lot, but that's one of the questions as these ranges, as grizzlies expand their range further north, or maybe polar bears find are encroached by grizzly bears, what's going to happen then? It's a very strange place where we are. You mentioned earlier the boreal forest meets the Arctic. I also want to say we have black bears, grizzly bears, and polar bears. It's one of the very few places in the world where those three species overlap. So it's kind of a little laboratory, a wild laboratory. And I think that we owe it to create this baseline study so that maybe 100 years from now, people will have some information. How many wolves were there? How were they relating with the polar bears at that point in time? So maybe that's what we have to offer to the scientific community as citizen scientists, is that we can start something now that other people can pick up 50 years, 100 years, 200 years down the road.
Yeah. I'm looking at your Instagram, and just before you wrap up, if we can, I just want to pick one photo, if we can, of yours that has attached to it a story that really stays with you, that you can walk us through, and we can share the photo link with our listeners so they can also look at it while you're sharing the story of its capture with us. But is there a wolf photo that we can go to that the lead up and the capture and the moment really stuck with you?
I think probably one of my favorite wolf photos that I've had the luck to make is a shot where I was laying down on the snow. There had been a bit of a blizzard, and I was out there in my parka, it's fur rimmed, and I'm laying down on the snow. This was shortly before the study began, when I had built the igloo, and the wolves were coming back. The wolf pack was coming back. I could see them in the distance, and I thought, okay, I knew nothing about wolves, very little. I didn't know how concerned do I need to be with safety. How close will these wolves get? I grew up hearing that a healthy wolf has never attacked a human being in North America. In history, of course, we know now that's not true, but I had also grown up with Farley Mowat's adventures of, mostly fictional adventures with wolves. So it was a moment for me of kind of uncertainty. And I lay down on the snow. I was by myself. I had left my shotgun back at the lodge because I was only going to go out for a little right outside the lodge. And I saw this wolf coming through the snow, and it was just spectacular. It was majestic. He's this Canis lupus nubilis, right? This cloud wolf, this kind of, and he's coming out of the falling snow with his amber eyes, just looking at me. And I was down low, and there was just that moment when I looked at this wolf, and I thought, wow, what is it thinking? It was so clear. This is another intelligent being. And I was just filled with curiosity. What does it think about me? And obviously he's already pissed all over my igloo. So we've got some kind of issue going on. And ultimately what happened was the wolves got closer and closer. And I had never been close to a wolf like this before. I sat up because generally the bigger you get, the animals will back off. This wolf came up to within, I would say, probably 4 or 5 feet. I finally stood up and said, you're too close. Kicked a little snow at him, and then slowly backed my way back to the lodge. But it was a thrilling encounter. And it was one of those moments where I thought, I want to know more. I want to know what this animal's thinking. I want to know, how does this animal survive where it can be down to minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit? How does it make it? What does it eat? So I think that would be the for me, the classic cloud wolf photo, this wolf kind of just standing there looking at me.
I think I'm looking at that one, actually.
I think I'm looking at it too, yeah.
Out from the left side of his body a little bit.
Yeah, and there's like two trees.
Yes, kind of in the distance
of something in the back.
It's very white.
Have you ever seen that animal again?
Yes, several times. That animal was one of the most curious of the wolves. And again, this was before the wolf study, when for me, I didn't know much about wolves. And it's something when you're out on foot with a wolf and then the rest of the pack shows up, you feel very small. And you realize these things. You asked about how it is they can hunt polar bears. Well, when you see, because the wolf pack came in, and at one point I had 4 or 5 wolves around me, and you could just see the pack behavior. They are communicating, and it's intimidating when they're that close and they're not used to people. And you think, what is going on? How are they communicating? They are social animals, extremely intelligent, and they're pack hunters, right? They're group hunters. Just extraordinary.
Man, did you foresee this if you were to go back 20 years and say, could you have ever imagined this would have been the point where you are in your life, that you're studying both of these animals simultaneously?
Oh, John, it's a funny question, because would I go back in time from here I am studying wolves, studying polar bears, to when I started my career out? And the funny thing is, I grew up about 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now in Denver. And I was such a terrible high school student. I used to ditch school, and instead of going out to smoke cigarettes, I would go across the street to a little wildlife refuge where I'd found a den of foxes. And I would just sit there and was mesmerized. I would sketch them and photograph them. And I thought, I want to be a fox biologist. I want to study these canines. And of course, then I graduated from high school. I didn't get into any colleges. I was a terrible student. And then I decided, well, I want to be a war photographer. And so I pursued that. And my war photography over a decade led to my work with National Geographic. And then it's kind of come back full circle now, where now I'm working on a wolf study. I'm studying these other canines, and I'm getting to be out in the field, watching wildlife, trying to learn things, talking with other biologists and naturalists, which is what I love more than anything. It's just that curiosity is what I enjoy.
I love that. My last question for you, Jad, and don't go anywhere because we want to promote your website and things like that, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Controversy. When I hear the word wolf now, knowing what I know now and what I'm learning, I've come to understand that people are very polarized on wolves. You have people that want to go out and hug them, and people that want to go out and kill them. So you have people that love them, people that hate them, and there's not a lot of middle ground. And I think part of what you guys are doing with your podcast is getting information out about wolves, getting accurate information out about wolves so that people are more informed. And I think that's all that any of us can hope to do. I don't consider myself a wolf advocate. I don't know enough right now. What I want to do is help people get information about wolves to make up their own minds. But controversy.
Well, I think you're doing a great job with that, because everything that you stated earlier, the fact that you have the First Nations there, you have individuals giving talks about wolf, mythology, about wolf biology. You have the citizen science study. This is a way for people to really get their hands dirty in a field that they may not have thought about early on, and now they're able to do that. So to me, that's the best way for someone to understand that situation, is to be thrown in that situation, and you're doing that in probably one of the most unique ways I've ever heard possible. So, kudos to you guys of what you're doing. Give everybody, Jad, your website, your Instagram, Churchill Wild website, where if you guys are sold out, but if they want to book a future visit, maybe in a couple of years, just give them information on how they can get involved and really look at your work and what's going on with Churchill Wild as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys. ChurchillWild.com will take you right to Churchill Wild's website. You can check out all the variety of kind of Arctic safaris they offer, as well as our citizen science wolf study. My own social media is simply at Jad Davenport. And then my website is my website is jaddavenport.com.
Nice. All right, just stick around after we sign off. I want to just talk with you for just another couple minutes. Jad Davenport, thanks so much, man. This was great. I'm thrilled to get you on here, and you're always welcome back anytime. All right?
Thanks, John and Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
You got it. House to all you out there, and we'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.